It's time for NASCAR to make some serious changes. How's it going, everybody? My name is Eric, and welcome to Out of the Groove, the show about NASCAR racing where we usually just talk about what's primarily on the racetrack. But since it's an off weekend, I figured I'd do something a little bit differently. Hasn't been really any bombshell news stories to come out so far this week, so I'll keep my fingers crossed for next week. But today we're primarily going to talk about more off the track, issues, topics, debates, which I think will be interesting because I've talked about it a little bit this year, but I've seen a lot of people across social media talking about NASCAR, the future of NASCAR recently, and I figured I want to kind of give a more clear stance, or at least I want to give my clear opinion on what I want for the sport and what I think we should be doing. A couple weeks ago, I saw this chart kind of making the rounds through social media. It obviously shows that NASCAR's television ratings have been on a steady, and actually this year, a steeper decline in the last few years. And now that is specifically highlighting the first 5 races of the last few years. But yeah, you can clearly see there's been a decline starting in 2015 and getting, I would say, noticeably worse in 2018, at least for a couple of those races. So I've seen that. There's been a lot of discussion around that and around ratings in general, and I kind of gave my opinion on that a couple weeks ago during an episode where I talked about how I think the biggest issue hurting ratings right now is the departure of big names like Jeff Gordon, Dale Earnhardt Jr., Carl Edwards, Tony Stewart, Matt Kenseth, and so on. And I still fully believe that is the reason for the bigger dip we've seen in ratings in the last couple of years, because before 2015, while ratings still weren't what they'd been in the early 2000s and whatnot during kind of the prime of NASCAR, I would say they were at least not dipping the way they have been the last couple of years. But if we're going to compare this year, 2018, to even, 10, 15 years ago, ratings have dipped considerably. There's no 100% perfect measurement for this, but most projections have suggested that viewership in top NASCAR races has dipped possibly close to 50% just in the last 10 to 15 years. And that, I gotta say, that's an alarming trend. It's not one that I've been oblivious to, but it's not one I focus on too much, because really up until the last 2 years or so, it hadn't really, the slope had been pretty flat, which isn't good. You always want to be growing, I suppose. But I guess really up until the last year or two with Jeff Gordon, Dale Jr. retiring and whatnot, until then, the slope hadn't been too bad. But it certainly isn't great. So what I thought I'd do today is basically tell you guys how I would change NASCAR. I'm going to look at a couple different aspects, address some things that a lot of people have been saying, and address things that NASCAR has or hasn't taken a look at. I'm going to look at a little bit of all, but I'm going to try and keep it relatively simple, short and sweet, but we'll see how it goes. I already basically hit on the ratings thing and what I really think is hurting ratings the last couple years especially, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Like I said, I think the biggest thing that's hurting ratings the last 2 years or so has been the departure of Jeff Gordon, Dale Jr., and Tony Stewart and others. And I've said this before, NASCAR is in just kind of a rebuilding phase. A lot of sports have gone through this. I've mentioned a couple weeks ago, one of my analogies was, the NBA had Michael Jordan. When he left, they had LeBron James rise up, so the NBA was okay. Dale Jr., Jeff Gordon are leaving, but hey, we got Ryan Blaney, Chase Elliott, Kyle Larson, who are already kind of on the rise and hopefully are able to carry the sport into the future. And of course, I've said this before, it's not likely that NASCAR will ever have the same power it did in the late 90s or early 2000s, but that doesn't mean to say it's going to continue to decline or suddenly become irrelevant. No, I fully believe in the next 3 to 5 years, we'll start to see a little bit of a pickup perhaps, or at least, once again, a steady, sustaining rate of viewers and sponsorship. At least that's what I believe, because I think a lot of these young drivers are going to create fans of their own. They're going to create fan bases that maybe don't get quite as big as Jeff Gordon or Dale Jr.'s, but I think they can at least rival them to some extent. So I think NASCAR, in that sense, on that front, is relatively okay, but I'll go into some other things. I also want to say I highly recommend checking out this video. Some of you, probably a lot of you, maybe have already seen it. It's one of the reasons that I actually thought about making this video, because I saw how the conversation was going over there, and I wanted to bring that over here as well and give my 2 cents. Check out Real Radman's video about, he calls it, why NASCAR is in deep trouble. I don't know if I'd go that far, but it definitely brings up some very interesting points. It's long, but it gives you some interesting points, and some of them I'm kind of going to address, or at least kind of tie into this video today. So go check that out, and then hear what I have to say. In that video, and from what I've heard from fans for years, is a lot of fans aren't super thrilled with the way the racing package looks these days. Specifically, we hear them talk on TV all the time about aerodynamics, and how cars get aero tight, aero loose, the importance of clean air as opposed to dirty air. We hear about that a lot, and that's really only been discussed more in, the last few years. Really, mainly since the Gen 6 car came out in 2013. At least that's when it became super duper relevant. A lot of NASCAR fans say the Gen 4 style of racing was the best style of racing, and I'll honestly say they're probably right in a lot of ways. It was competitive, cars could pass each other, but it wasn't like super easy to pass each other. The cars were easy to drive, but not so easy that, you know, there wasn't a wreck or there wasn't anyone that ran into trouble. They were a challenge, but it was a manageable challenge where drivers were willing to make bold moves and big risks because they felt like they were in control. However, in 2008, the Gen 5 car came out, and remember the big wings, the car of tomorrow, those were not great. The racing was and you know, they made some improvements into 2010, 2011, 2012, but it still wasn't great. I would argue the cars perhaps became almost too easy to drive in a lot of ways. In 2013, then, NASCAR introduced the Gen 6 car, which is supposed to give the cars a more authentic look, a look that ties them more closely to the actual cars, the street cars that they're based off of. That's why you see the Toyota Camrys and Ford Fusions on the track today. They do look a lot more like the actual Ford Fusions and Toyota Camrys you see on the streets, and I've got to say, they look kind of cool. But other than the fact that I think they look really cool, the racing has been iffy. I will say this, I don't think the racing package that we have today is really the biggest thing hurting NASCAR's ratings or hurting its appeal with a lot of fans. I think what we have today is actually pretty decent. I think we see good passing on most tracks. We still hear people talk about aero stuff, but that's always been the case. It's not as defining of a factor as it was. I will say, the beginning of the Gen 6 era, 2013, 2014, specifically 2013, we saw, especially on mile and a halves, those cars were too much to handle. There was too much aero sensitivity to these race cars, and it was just, the races weren't that much fun. But they've been experimenting, like at Indianapolis last year, and they've experimented a lot in the Xfinity Series the last couple of years with different spoiler packages that honestly, I think this year the racing on mile and a halves and whatnot has been pretty decent. I mean, if you compare it back to like 2005, 2004 with the Gen 4 car, maybe a lot of people would still prefer that, and there's pros and cons to both, but I will say this, I don't think the aero package is anything super major to be changed. That's one thing about NASCAR I don't know that I would change at all, just because I feel like it would be very expensive, and I don't know that NASCAR is in a position that they want to invest millions and millions of dollars on developing a brand new race car at this point, especially when, like I said, I feel like the racing these days isn't terrible. I gotta say, I think they really hit on a plate racing package that we saw in the Daytona 500 that was really exciting to watch. So I'll give them that. If they're gonna make any changes to the car, I want them to do something that makes the cars, you know, a little more stable, or at least makes it so cars are able to run up on another car and pass them, or at least able to, you know, make moves on them without being so reliant on just pure aerodynamics. I don't like that dirty air is such a disadvantage to clean air. It's better now than it was in 2013. 2013, these cars were too hard to drive on a lot of these tracks. They were just so sensitive. They've improved that a little bit, and I like mostly what we see these days. But if I were to change anything, just do something to make the racing a little bit closer, a little bit, make it, I don't want to say easier to pass, because you don't want races where drivers just catch a guy and pass him right away. That's not fun. You want them to be able to battle, but you want the cars to at least be able to get side by side with each other. The problem is with the old Gen 6 and even kind of the current Gen 6 to some extent, you don't get that much side by side action for lap after lap on the bigger, faster tracks. You tend to have cars gain, and then once they get about this far from a guy, they'll ride behind them for several laps because they just can't get clean enough air to actually make the pass. So as far as the cars themselves goes, that's all I really got. A lot of people also talk about the NASCAR Cup Series schedule, and now this is something I would make, as I'm sure a lot of people would, I would make a lot of changes to this. And I don't want this to come across as mean-spirited, because I know a lot of people like their home tracks, and I don't mean to pick on you if I don't like your home track, but there are just some tracks that we either have a lot of that produce similar racing, or that are just boring. So if you ask me, NASCAR, the big thing they need is more short tracks. That's what people have been saying for years, and it's 100% true. In the mid to late 90s, when NASCAR was booming, the biggest drawback to that was NASCAR needed to build tracks that could hold large numbers of people. So that's why we had tracks like Texas, or like, I think Kansas was built around then. You had these big Chicagoland type tracks that seat 80, 100,000 of people, but let's be real, they don't produce on a consistent basis the same kind of exciting racing we see at Martinsville or Bristol. I don't want to saturate the schedule with a bunch of short tracks. Don't get me wrong, I like the big mile and a halves from time to time, but right now we got too many of them, so some of them gotta go. If you ask me, you got Las Vegas, Texas Motor Speedway, and Kansas that all have 2 races each. So if you ask me, at least one of those races has to go. I mean, either take away one of the Vegas races. I know they just gave Vegas a race, but I think you either got to take away a Vegas race, take away one of the Texas races, as much as I love Texas, or take away a Kansas race. You can't have all of those races all the time. That's too much. We've only been going to Kentucky for a few years. Heck, just get Kentucky out of there and swap it out with Iowa. The Xfinity Series races at Iowa. The reason the Cup Series doesn't is I assume they don't think it holds enough people, but nowadays it would probably sell out. And then the biggest change that I think should be the first change made, honestly, is they need to get rid of one of the Pocono races. Pocono is a beautiful racetrack, beautiful area of the country, very picturesque views over there at Pocono, but it has 2 races over the span of like a month. That's too much Pocono, too many triangles. Get rid of a Pocono race, get rid of 1, maybe 2.5 races from a track that has multiple dates, and then maybe swap Kentucky out or put Iowa in there somewhere, or maybe throw in a road course that the Xfinity or Trucks goes to, perhaps. Or better yet, I know NASCAR, none of the Speedway Motorsports, none of these International Speedway Corporations, none of them are ever going to do this, probably because it'd be too expensive. Just build another track like Bristol or like Martinsville, a short track that is built almost like a bowl where you can seat 100,000+ people. I mean, Bristol is one of the smallest tracks on the circuit, but it seats more than almost all the bigger tracks. I know from a business standpoint, to invest millions and millions and millions of dollars into building a racetrack for a sport that isn't exactly on the uptick right now, maybe wouldn't be the wisest idea to most of them, but I'm sure if they take the risk, I think it might have some benefits. But that's just me. Short, simple, add more short tracks, get rid of a couple of the cookie cutter 1.5 miles and a Pocono race. Get rid of a Pocono race. I'm just saying. So moving on, another thing that a lot of people talk about changing, and maybe because it changes all the time, is the playoff format. The last couple of years, I've kind of defended the playoff format with the chase grids and all that. I actually, for the most part, kind of like it. But I think if we were to change it, which I think it could definitely use some changes, there's a couple things that definitely, and I mean definitely, should be changed if we're going to make this thing, if we're going to improve it. Firstly, get rid of the win in your in system for the regular season. The fact that you can win the Daytona 500 and then run 30th the rest of the season for 25 more races and still make the playoffs, that's a joke. That is a joke. It's stupid. If you're an Austin Dillon fan, honestly, you have no reason to watch until September, because you know he's going to make the playoffs. I mean, if he wrecks out tomorrow, wrecks out 10 more times, it doesn't matter. You're making the playoffs. So it's stupid. Get rid of it. End of story. Another thing I would change is I would shorten the field back to, the first 7-10 years of the chase we had it was only 10, and then for a while it was 12 cars involved. I think that's what we should go back to. Make it 10, make it 12, I don't really care. Make it 10, actually. Just make it 10, I think. I think at the end of race 26, the 26th race of the season, the end of the regular season, the top 10 in just total points make the playoffs, and from there you can stack them up based on wins, then give them bonus points and stage wins the way they do now. I think that's a smart plan. So seed them accordingly, and then I still like the knockout round playoff format. I honestly do. I know, I'm the kind of person, if they went back to what they had in 2002, 2003, I'd be just fine with it, but I do kind of like the playoff grid. I think it appeals to a younger audience, and I think that's something NASCAR needs to try and do more than they need to appeal to the older audience. It's fine. It's nice to hold on to your old fans too, don't get me wrong, but you always need to make new fans, because nobody lives forever. Those guys aren't going to be fans forever. You need the new fans coming. So I like the knockout round playoff format. And if you have it with 10 drivers, here's my proposition: you go from 10 down to 6, and then from there you eliminate 2 each round. You go from 10 to 6, then 6 to 4, and then you go from 4 to just 2. I think it would be really cool if when we get to Homestead in mid-November, you only had 2 guys still out there racing for the championship. It would give the fans, a defined line to divide themselves between. Half would go on this guy, half would go on that guy, and you could just duke it out from there. Plus, it eliminates possibilities like we might have had in 2014 when a guy like Ryan Newman, who just barely snuck into the top 4 on that last lap dirty move at Phoenix, just barely managed to grab that 4th spot, and then he almost won the championship that year, despite not winning any races. I think if you limited it to only the top 2 people in points can make it to Homestead and have a chance to win the championship, I think that would do a good job of potentially eliminating future drivers from winning it that maybe don't necessarily deserve to win it as much. That's just my 2 cents on the playoffs. There you go. Let me know what you guys think. So anyway, let's run down. What are my changes? Add more short tracks, get rid of a Pocono and maybe one of the 1.5 miles. Change the playoffs from 16 down to 10. Get rid of the win in your in system. Make it only the top 10 in points. Make it, and from there, trim it down to where it's only 2 left at Homestead. I think that would be exciting. Ignore the people who bash on NASCAR's ratings from the last year or two, and remind them that we lost 3 or 4 of our most popular drivers. And then lastly, focus on innovating the race car so that it can create closer racing that isn't so reliant on clean air. I know we as racing fans hate talking about air and talking about downforce, side force, all that force. We don't like to talk about it because it's not fun. It takes away from, the actual drivers on track racing and all that. It's not fun to talk about. So if you're going to make changes to the car, because I think the car we have now is not bad, but if you're going to make changes to the car, make air not a topic of conversation anymore. I'm not a scientist. I don't know the way to do that. I know there's a lot of suggestions out there that people make, that NASCAR has even made. Although I will say this, I'm gonna finish this video with one last, soapbox speech. I don't want to join the bandwagon that just hates on NASCAR's leadership like Brian France, because I don't like to join bandwagons. There's enough people out there saying a bunch of bad stuff, hating on him and giving him, the proper amount of criticism. I don't feel like I need to pile on. But I've been doing some thinking the last couple weeks, and I've been looking at a lot of the stuff people have been saying, and I've been looking at what Brian France and team have and have not been doing, and I gotta say, Brian France is conclusively the worst, probably the worst CEO commissioner in all of major sports. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir for most of you guys. Most of you guys probably agree with me. Me saying that's nothing new. You're probably like, oh, finally you realize that. But NASCAR's faced all this criticism, in recent years, recent weeks, recent days. They've had all these, there's all these question marks up in the air, juggling back and forth. And I can't find any time, anywhere, where the leadership of NASCAR, specifically Brian France, has come out and offered any sort of solution, offered any sort of plan, any sort of innovation, any semblance of that NASCAR knows what they're doing and understands that they need to make important decisions. They hired like a new president or something not that long ago, who I will say I've seen him on social media some at least, but even he's not saying anything important really. I get that the CEO of NASCAR doesn't want to say like, oh yeah, we know ratings aren't that great, we know it. That's not a great PR move, don't get me wrong, I understand it, but at this point I feel like it's out in the open. A lot of people know it, see it, talk about it. Can you at least offer any sort of showing that you care or that you understand the gravity of the situation? You don't even have to come out and say, oh, here's 5 plans, exactly what we're going to be doing the next couple years to improve it. You don't even have to be that specific. Just say something to give us a little bit of hope that we're here. Because I don't get that impression. I don't see them talk about anything of any value whatsoever. Ever. It's ridiculous. So if this video accomplishes nothing else, I hope it reaches somebody at NASCAR's office. And I want to look me in the eye, you corporate suits. I have been an avid fan of your sport for almost 14 years. I have spent thousands on merchandise, race tickets, your goddamn race view that doesn't work half the time. I'd like to know a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes and what plans you possibly have for our sport going forward. Is that too much to ask? I'm not alone. Please. I hope that reaches somebody out there. But anyway, thanks for watching everybody. That is my episode. I'll talk again later next week. I'll give you my picks for Texas. I'll talk about any other news that possibly comes out through this week. I might do something fun. I did a couple weeks ago, I did a top 10 drivers of the 2000s, which I talked about an article that was written a while back. I gave you my opinion on it. I might do that again, maybe for the 90s. I didn't watch racing in the 90s, but some people suggested it. Now I'll look at the stats and I'll give you my very misguided opinion on it. But yeah, maybe we'll do that. But anyway, guys, yeah, thanks for watching. Leave your opinions in the comments below or tweet at me at Twitter @Dex Racing. And yeah, go check out that video I told you guys about. It was very interesting, very long. I agree with a lot of what's being said there and around the rest of the internet and on TV and everywhere, but I think it's good to, I just want to get my opinion out there steadily, because a lot of people have been asking me the last few days, have been asking me my opinion on these types of things. I've done podcasts a couple times, I've had these questions asked. I just want to put it out there in one special long, I just dropped my phone, long video that covers all of the bases, all of my bases here. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you guys again very, very soon. Have a great Easter weekend, and I'll see you next week. See you guys.